What is up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you by the Hockey News and presented by Sticks.com. I am your host, Emma Lingan. I'm joined today by Jonathan Bailey, who covers the Philadelphia Flyers for us here at the Hockey News, and Kelsey Surmacz, who covers the Pittsburgh Penguins. We are here today talking about the Metro Division, all things Metro Division, and there's plenty to talk about today. So before we do get into all of that, do want to remind you all that we are brought to you by Sticks.com. Why break the bank on sticks when you can get pro-level composite sticks without the pro price tag at Sticks.com? That's Stix.com. Head there now and gear up. All right. Well, if only something exciting had happened in the Metro Division recently, like perhaps, I don't know, Trevor Zegras getting traded to the Philadelphia Flyers. This obviously there's been a lot of talk for really feels like years at this point about Zegras getting traded. Finally happens. Kelsey, I'll start with you. What do you think Zegras' role will be with the Flyers? Because, he's coming from a situation in Anaheim where he had kind of fallen out of, maybe not out of favor, but he just didn't really have a clear role anymore. And injury had partly to do with that. I think some of the other draft picks they had to do with that. Is he really capable of being a number one center with the Flyers, in your opinion?
I wouldn't maybe jump to say number one center, but he certainly makes their top six better. And he makes their center depth better too. I think this was a trade that made sense for both parties. I think the return was maybe a little light on Anaheim's side. But at the end of the day, Trevor Zegras needed a change of scenery. I think this is a really perfect situation for him because the Flyers are kind of on the up and coming, like a lot of other teams in the East. They have Tyson Forster, Travis Konechny. They still have a solid top six. And, you got Noah Cates, Sean Couturier. So, there's some fluidity with what his role could be on the roster. I'm kind of curious to see where they place him in the lineup. But I do think, he's going to help their power play too. So I'm kind of curious to see how this situation plays out because I think this is definitely a good situation for the Flyers. It made them that much deeper. And I think this is kind of the first step they're going to take towards really trying to push for contention this season, like a lot of these other teams in the East.
Yeah. John, what did you think of the trade as far as the return? I kind of agree with you, Kelsey, on the return being a little light on Anaheim's side. John, what'd you make of the trade overall?
Yeah, it definitely was light. The Ducks are selling low on a talented player, but with Philadelphia, they got a player they identified in Ryan Poehling as someone who's going to fill a need for them. So they've established that Karlsson and McTavish is going to be their top six centers. Ryan Strome can play center. He played in New York with Frank Vatrano, Chris Kreider. And then you have Poehling, who could play the fourth line center. Fast, kills penalties, can bring some offense every once in a while. And then you get a second and a fourth. So it's not, I don't think, terrible, as some people would say. But yes, definitely light and selling low on a talented player.
All right, well, let's head to the western side of the state now. Let's talk about the Penguins. Kelsey, we're in your territory now. They officially now have the 12th overall pick from the New York Rangers as part of the whole JT Miller trade and all of that. All of the dust is finally settling on that. So the Penguins now have 11 picks in this year's draft. And what a place to be when you are a team that is kind of going against the grain with the rest of the East right now and actually kind of trying to take a step back maybe and rebuild, restock that young talent. So now that they've got the 11th overall pick, the 12th overall pick, how much do you think this draft in particular is going to really sort of kickstart this rebuild for them?
Well, I think this having this pick changes a lot for them. I'm not necessarily surprised. I think on the Rangers end, this made some degree of sense, and I know we'll get to that in a second. But on Pittsburgh's end, they haven't had back-to-back picks. And, Kyle Dubas kind of emphasized this at the end of the season, his end of season presser too. The Penguins are ready to shift to the execution phase of this rebuild. And, he's reiterated time and time again that they want to get this done as quickly as possible. But they're still not putting a timestamp on it. But having 2 top 12 picks is a really big deal for a couple reasons. Number one, there are a few teams, namely Chicago, that are potentially looking to move, down in the draft. Pittsburgh has been reported to potentially be interested in moving up in the draft order. So, if they can get up there, draft somebody like a Porter Martone, a James Higgins, in addition to a Keishon Aitchison with one of those 2 picks, that makes a big difference for them. And I think at this point, quality is going to be the focus for Pittsburgh because they kind of have a quantity of prospects that are near NHL ready. Dubas wants to target young talent. They can get to, legitimate players in this draft now. So I think this changes a lot for them, just in terms of being able to add quality prospects to their pool. And, it kind of gives them a little bit of creativity too, that they didn't have before. They could do something with that pick as well. Dubas has talked about the RFA sign and trade market. So, there's a couple opportunities for young players out there. And I'm kind of curious to see if they end up drafting 2 players, moving up, or if they might do something with that Rangers pick.
Yeah, well, talking about potentially moving up in the draft order, potentially a way they could do that is by trading 1 or 2 of their roster players. And of course, the Penguins, again, not exactly news here that they've been interested in dealing Erik Karlsson. So reportedly, Karlsson is willing to waive his no move clause to go to a contender. Now, the Penguins, on the other hand, are willing to retain some salary there. So do you think, Kelsey, that would be the right move for the Penguins to part with Karlsson should the opportunity arise, or is he someone who's going to be sort of consequential in this rebuild that they're doing right now?
I do think this situation is a bit more complicated than it might seem. Obviously, with Karlsson's contract, the Penguins are paying $10 million of his 11.5. San Jose retained a little bit on that. So, contract-wise and logistically, just for where they're at and in terms of their rebuild and in the phase they're in, you should jump at an opportunity to deal someone like that if the situation presents itself. Now, where this gets a little bit hairy, though, is the Penguins already need 2 top 4 defensemen on the left side. And obviously Karlsson's a right defenseman. Chris Letang's a right defenseman. But, Josh Yohe of The Athletic wrote a nice piece about this a couple weeks ago. The Penguins are kind of at a crossroads with Chris Letang too. I think they're at a point where they realize they need to reduce his role, reduce his minutes. Trading Karlsson kind of creates another need. So I think if, he is dealt, this has to be calculated. They have to get a defenseman as part of the return. They have to have a contingency plan to get a replacement for him because prospects like Harrison Brunick, Owen Pickering on the left side aren't ready for those top 4 roles yet. So, you go from needing 2 top 4 defensemen and needing 3 all of a sudden. So a little bit more hairy than it seems, but I think at the end of the day, if they can find a way to offload that salary and give themselves a little bit more flexibility, they should do that.
All right, that's a good point. Interesting. Going to be interesting times in Pittsburgh. Kind of uncharted territory, or not recently charted territory for the Penguins here. John, want to move on to you now. Want to ask about the Rangers. Going off of that, the pick that we just discussed. Now sending their first round pick to the Penguins. So the Penguins now have 2 picks. Do you think, John, that it was smart for the Rangers to opt in for this pick to be moved this year as opposed to next year's pick, just kind of given what their needs are in this particular draft class? Because, looking ahead to next year, the Rangers don't have a second or a fourth in 2026. So their trade assets would need to be weaker next season, but it's possible, to give up 12th overall with a pretty weak prospect pipeline, but what do you think overall of their decision here?
I think it was the smart thing to do, right? Like the 12th pick is not a great one, But on another hand, I look at next year and I say, well, it's not exactly a vote of confidence that we'll finish better than 12th or better than the lottery range. And they've already had a number of, publicized issues with morale and that kind of thing. So it's another way to look at it that I don't think people are considering enough. But generally, if you think it's a possibility that you could end up in McKenna range, then you have to account for that, and you got to keep your pick and take your shot.
Yeah, that's a good point about the morale and the front office situation, and the sort of exodus going on in New York. But Kelsey, what do you think? I mean, obviously the Penguins being on the receiving end of this year's pick, do you think it's better from their standpoint to have that pick this year or next year, or do you think it makes a big difference?
I think in terms of Pittsburgh, they're pretty clear sellers right now. And for the phase they're in, I mean, there's a good chance they're going to be in that lottery range anyway. So I almost think to some degree, they probably kind of preferred to have the pick this year just so they could kind of get a jump on getting some of that higher end talent sooner. But as far as the Rangers end, I mean, I think the biggest angle to consider maybe is that this could be used as a trade chip because, the Rangers don't hire a coach like Mike Sullivan if they're not intending on winning now. So, that 2026 pick gives the Rangers options. It gives them, the option to leverage that pick if they're contending. If they're not, they have potentially a lottery ticket. So I think for both sides, this kind of makes sense. And in terms of Pittsburgh, like I said earlier, they get to draft two good players this year, and it's going to kind of give them a jump on being able to do this as quickly as possible, rebuild this roster as quickly as possible. So I think it's a win-win on both sides.
Yeah, and like you said, you don't hire Mike Sullivan if you're not trying to win right now, and that's a big part of why Sullivan did end up leaving Pittsburgh, because the organization is just not, the timing didn't line up with where they're at and where he's at in his career. Speaking of teams that are trying to win now, let's head to Carolina. Let's talk about the Hurricanes here. So Cam Robinson from Elite Prospects said this week that there's some smoke out there that Carolina could be looking to bring in Tomas Hertl. So Hertl had 32 goals, 61 points in 72 games with Vegas last season. He's got 4 years left on his contract with a $6.75 million cap hit. So, of course, he had some salary retained by San Jose in the trade to Vegas a couple years ago. John, what do you think of Hertl as a fit with Carolina? Do you think that he's a guy who can really help them get over the hump in the Eastern Conference? Obviously, this is something that they've historically struggled with, is getting not past the first round, but past the second round. And then, this year they made it past the second round, and then they were just no match for the Florida Panthers. But then again, who was? I think, what do you think of Hertl, and how much could he feasibly be, helping Carolina get over the hump?
Well, I think he's still a really good player. I mean, 32 goals, pretty sure that was his second highest of his career in the NHL. So he can still do it. Making a lot of money. I assume Vegas was clearing money for a Mitch Marner or equivalent, which is a pretty impressive place to be when you could say, oh, Tomas Hertl is my cap dump this summer. If you're the Hurricanes, having a 1-2 punch with Aho, and maybe Jack Roslovic leaves, we don't know, but having that 1-2 punch with a player who's proven to be a pretty good offensive player and a good two-way player as well, it might give them a little more firepower that they probably need to crack the tougher teams.
Kelsey, what do you think? Is Carolina the kind of team that's really just a Tomas Hertl away from being a legitimate, being able to compete with the Florida Panthers of the world, or do you think they might be a little bit farther away than that?
Carolina's a tough case, and I've talked about this before. It's tough to play from behind against Carolina Hurricanes, but the fact of the matter is that they just don't get enough offensive production. They need, some legit top line players. And when you look in terms of high end talent, I just don't think their high end talent is as high end as a team like Florida's and some of these other contending teams, Toronto. So I do think someone like Hertl helps them, move towards that. But I still think they might need another piece. And you think about what they've missed out on the last couple of years. Jake Gensel doesn't re-sign after, they made a big splash for him. And then obviously the situation with Mikko Rantanen this year, they need to finally kind of land on a guy that's going to stick around. So if they can get Hertl and have him for 3 more years, I think that will help them pretty significantly. But I'm kind of still of the belief that they probably need, one more piece to really put themselves over the top, because they're a well-structured team. They just need guys to put the puck in the net, and so they can get ahead early and play ahead rather than playing from behind.
Definitely. All right, let's head up to New Jersey here. Jake Allen has not closed the door on returning to the Devils in free agency. Two sides are still talking. Do you think that, John, I'll ask you, New Jersey may not have the cap space to re-sign him, and depending on other moves that they may or may not want to make this offseason, I mean, do you think that re-signing him would be the right move? Of course, cost contingent, but what kind of number do you think would make sense for the Devils if they were to look to re-sign him?
Yeah, like you said, it's going to depend almost entirely on the cost. I think given his age, given his role, I would say $4 million is a pretty good spot. I wouldn't go over that. With the goalie market as weak as it is this summer, it's going to be pretty easy to get into a bidding war. Edmonton's going to be in there. The Flyers might be in there. So you could get outbid pretty quickly. For Allen, it's going to come down to, does he want to stay? And with the team that he's played for the last 2 seasons, does he feel New Jersey is the best chance to win? But that's going to come at a price. And, the Devils have other needs. Like Kovacevic is going to be out for a little bit after his knee injury in the playoffs. They need wingers. They just got rid of Erik Karlsson, sent him to Nashville. So they need a third-line center. Those aren't cheap. Maybe they do something with Andre Palat and his $6 million contract. But there's a lot of ifs, and free agency's coming quick. So I don't know. Allen's going to cost a lot.
Yeah, you mentioned the, free agency's coming. They've got some other pieces. You hear Palat's name out there a lot, and, potential salary dump moves. Haula, like you mentioned, was a salary dump move. Do you think, what can you say about Tom Fitzgerald and what he's been doing to kind of flesh out the forward market? Because it seems like, if you are going to be looking to offload those higher price pieces, theoretically, you're clearing room for someone or something in particular, obviously, with this being a team that has, of course, playoff aspirations again. What can you say about, what they're kind of eyeing on the forward market right now, John?
I think their top priority is going to have to be a third line center. Bottom 6 really just wasn't good enough last year offensively. You saw in the playoffs what happened when Jack Hughes was out. You had Jesper Bratt playing on the second line with Erik Karlsson and Cody Glass. So I think Tom Fitzgerald knows that he can't have that again if they are to be a serious playoff contender. That said, third line centers are not going to be cheap. You might, if Sam Bennett's probably staying in Florida, so you might be looking at a Pius Suter, for example, but that's $4 or $5 million right there. Or you could spend $4 or $5 million on Jake Allen, but if something happens to Markstrom, like he had an injury this winter, then you're turning the keys over to Nico Dawes, who is like career 500 in the NHL and about in the 890s, high 890s save percentage. And he's had a hip surgery recently. So if you don't sign Allen, you take the risk. If you do sign Allen, you take the risk of not upgrading your forward group, and then you have the fans on your back. So it's going to be a tough spot for them. They have a lot of needs.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kelsey, I want to move on and ask you about Columbus right now. How surprised are you that the Blue Jackets have not re-signed Ivan Provorov yet? Because it seemed like sort of a foregone conclusion, but I feel like the longer we go without news, it's, the rumor mill starts to churn. So, first of all, how surprised are you that they haven't re-signed him yet? Do you think they will? And then, if so or if not, how do you think this affects their plans at the draft, specifically with their first round pick?
I still think I'm of the belief that this is something that's still going to get done. I think I would think there's mutual interest on both sides here. The left defensive market's a little thin. We've heard other names out there, Keandre Miller, one of them. But, I think this is a guy that, proved that he can eat those minutes. He was a big part of them almost making the playoffs last season. And, given the other players in the blue line, if they lose him, that's a big loss. So I think this is something that's going to get done eventually. I don't necessarily think it's going to affect their draft plans all that much because if they lose Provorov, I'm of the belief that they're probably going to go out and just try to replace him, maybe potentially moving that first round pick. But I think this is a situation where we're going to see an agreement eventually. Time's ticking, but I think this is something that's going to get done.
Yeah, John, what do you think about just sort of the market right now for free agent defensemen? I mean, it's a pretty thin market, so I would imagine that Columbus is probably trying to prioritize that. Is there anything that you could see them doing maybe that would prompt them to seriously consider moving that first round pick that they have?
It wouldn't stun me if they held on to it, only because like Provorov is a pending free agent. Then you can turn the keys over to one of your top prospects in Denton Mateychuk, which I think is what they're looking to ultimately do, is to push their young guys forward. So I wouldn't be stunned if they kept the pick, Provorov goes, and then maybe it's Mateychuk, Corson Kulemans, Stanislav Svozil. They have guys they can put into the lineup, but at the same time, can you build a contender with a team that is entirely 25 years old, 24 years old, 23 years old? Not always. So it's tough to say because if they want to replace Provorov, it's going to be hard to do that.
Yeah, he's not an easily replaceable guy on the blue line, but I'm kind of with you, Kelsey. I think it's going to get done. I think that they have the flexibility to do it, and if they are sort of in this situation where they're, I mean, they were almost a playoff team this year, sort of against what anyone expected, but I think that they're going to be looking to stay in that range and maybe get over that hump this year. All right, let's talk about Washington. Washington's an interesting case. The Capitals, they have been one of the, I would say, a more rare success story in terms of the retool on the fly strategy. Doesn't always work when you try to do it. Kelsey could probably speak to that in Pittsburgh. Doesn't always work out as well as it did for Washington. I think a lot of that is, taking the right bets on the right guys at the right time. I mean, no one that they added last year in free agency was necessarily, they weren't going out and adding a Mitch Marner in free agency or a Sam Bennett or anything like that. So, it's they took a flyer on some guys and they all happened to hit at the right time. But I also think what's impressive about the way that Washington has gone about this sort of retooling process is that they've built a pretty impressive prospect pool in the process. So, over the last few years, they've gotten guys like Andrew Kristall, Ilya Protas, Cole Hudson. I mean, what's the biggest, Kelsey, I'll ask you first. What do you think is the biggest positional need that Washington has now as they head into the draft this season? They're picking 27th in the first round. So definitely, of course, not a high pick, but I mean, is that a pick that you think that they might consider moving, whether it's to move up, to move back, to get an NHL ready player? I mean, where do you kind of see them going as far as their prioritization this offseason?
I mean, I think to some extent the priority has to be thinking about life after Alex Ovechkin, right? Because, all indications point to this probably being Ovechkin's last season. Obviously there's, nothing set in stone. But, I think this is a case, Anthony Beauvillier did fine in the playoffs in the top six. He was kind of in and out of that role. But I do think they really need to get a top six forward still. That would probably be my target if I was Washington. And given, this core of young players they've built, they've managed to kind of hit on all their draft picks. I wouldn't be surprised to see them move that pick to kind of get, a more bona fide top six player. Because like I said, you kind of have to start planning ahead for those kinds of things. This is something that Washington has done a really good job of. And, the reason their retool worked, they kind of got ahead of everything. So if I'm Washington, I'm targeting top six help. I'm potentially looking to move that pick to get that top six help. And then, if Ovechkin does decide to hang him up after next season, you can maybe breathe a little easier, sleep a little easier if you're Washington. And, like I said, you have that young core to work around. So their defense seems set. I think that forward unit is just something that they need to add a little bit more depth to.
Yeah, John, what do you think? Do you think that they're gonna, the Capitals, I tend to agree. I don't think they're in a position where they're gonna fall off a cliff as soon as Ovechkin leaves. So John, how well do you think they're set up right now for life after Ovechkin? And, what areas do you think they need to really look at strengthening?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Kelsey. I think the Caps really need to find a winger. If they wanted to draft a replacement or a long-term piece for Ovechkin, you can't replace Ovechkin, but you could get another young winger in the draft. But are you getting the one you want with a late first? Probably not. So you can maximize Ovechkin's last year, find some immediate help. Maybe it's someone on the younger side. Not that JJ Peterka would cost just that. But if you could find a move like that where you have a player that can help now and then will be around for the future, I think you have to do it.
All right. Well, let's wrap up our discussion of the Metro division today and talk about the Islanders. A lot going on with the Islanders right now. They've got a new GM, and as hey, welcome to your new job. How about a number one overall pick, Matthew Darche? So that's what is happening on the island right now. So he's got a lot on his plate. Number one overall pick, of course, but everyone's sort of the assumption that is going to be used to draft Matthew Schaefer, the consensus number one pick defenseman in this year's draft class. But that's not all that Darche is having to deal with on Long Island right now. He's got some pretty big name RFAs that he's going to have to negotiate new contracts with, or potentially trade, move on from when their value is this high. One of those guys, of course, is Noah Dobson. 70-point defenseman, very much the kind of player that the Islanders would like to keep to build around as they sort of kind of start to build around this newer core that they have. Of course, they would like to keep him. Kelsey, I'll ask you, do you think that the Islanders are going to be able to extend Dobson? Is it one of those ones kind of like Columbus with Provorov, where it's like you kind of assume it'll get done? Or is it something where maybe a trade might be the way to go here? And, if that's the case, what kind of teams could you see maybe being interested?
Well, I'll start there. If I'm Pittsburgh, I'm interested in Noah Dobson. I think there's going to be a lot of takers on the market. We've talked about how the defensive market is pretty thin this year in free agency. And Dobson will be a really highly sought after blue liner. And, I think the draft kind of does factor in here, because if they do draft Matthew Schaefer, you consider the fact that they could get a really good return for Dobson, draft Matthew Schaefer, and then, they haven't really lost much in my opinion. So I think this is something you have to consider if you're the Islanders for the right return on Dobson. But obviously, if they're able to get it done, you get it done. This isn't somebody you want to lose. It's better to have Dobson and Schaefer rather than just one of them. So if you're the Islanders, I think this still has to be a priority to try to extend this guy. But I mean, I think the draft kind of makes that situation a little bit more fluid because, Schaefer is pretty widely regarded as somebody who's probably going to play in the NHL next year at some point. So, I think that makes this a little bit hairier than it might seem. The draft might actually have a little bit of an effect here.
Yeah, I mean, if you're the Islanders, you've got Dobson, you've also got Alexander Romanov. I mean, you've got a lot of pieces that you need to shore up here on the blue line. And a part of me wonders if maybe that's why we haven't really heard much noise on that end yet, is because it's going to depend on what happens at the draft. And now Darsh has said, we're not necessarily picking someone based on whether or not they're going to be able to play and make an impact at the NHL level next year. That said, it's extremely rare that a number one overall pick, at least in recent years, doesn't play in the NHL the following year. So, John, I'll ask you, what do you think for the Islanders is going to be the best move here? I think as they look to sort of shore up their blue line. Again, Darsh has said that he would like to keep Dobson, and of course, who wouldn't? I mean, talking to Kelsey with what teams would be interested. I think a shorter list would be what teams wouldn't be interested in a player like that. So, what do you think it would take for the Islanders to get something done and to hold on to him?
Well, I think it's going to cost a lot. You could be potentially looking at double digits in cap hit, which you could argue is fair, especially with the rising cap. If they weren't going to keep him, there's been a lot of talk about trading up and going to get Long Island native James Higgins. So if you look at teams that are potentially willing to sell, you look at Chicago, you look at Utah, I could see maybe the Flyers for the right price. If whatever pick is going to cost, the sixth pick and change one way or the other, I could see that because you have Zegras now, and then you have a pretty fun team. But the Islanders, I could see them leaning both ways. Given that Darsh has already re-signed Kyle Palmieri, I don't think that they're just going to blow it up and trade everybody. So I think the path of least resistance there is going to be finding a solution with Dobson and paying up.
All right. Well, definitely an interesting situation to keep an eye on as we head into the draft here in just a few days. Lots of calls, lots of GMs on the phone, lots of wheeling and dealing. So will definitely be something to keep an eye on there. Outside of the draft, one more thing I did want to touch on today before we close here is the 2025 Hockey Hall of Fame class was announced today. I'm going to read through quickly. We've got Jennifer Botterill, Brianna Decker, Duncan Keith, Alex McGillney, Joe Thornton, Zdeno Chara, Jack Parker, and Danielle Sauvageau. So, Kelsey, any of those names surprise you? Or any, is it just kind of par for the course? Any of these that you're particularly excited about? What are your reactions?
I think this is a good list. I don't think there's any misses on this list. Every single person that was named this year is deserving. And it's really nice to see Chara get recognition and get that honor this year. He was just an incredible player when he played. And he helped Boston to that title run. So, I'm happy for Chara. The Penguins, I had to play him for a long time. And, he was a tough guy to play against. So Chara is kind of my guy that I'm happy to see him in there. And, I think all of these are good choices. Duncan Keith, obviously 3-time Stanley Cup champion with Chicago. Another one. Just nice to see the D-men get recognition in this class.
Yeah, definitely. John, what do you think about this list for the class of 2025?
I was surprised to see Alex McGillney get in, but in a good way. I think, each year that passes and he doesn't get in, you wonder when is going to be the year. Is it going to be next year? Is it going to be the year after that? But they finally did it. They put him in with Thornton. They put him in with Duncan Keith, two great players, Chara as well. So I think it fits perfectly. Put him in with, stars that led their teams for decades. I think that's a fitting end to the saga for him. It's just too long.
Yeah, I would say that was
Agreed.
kind of the bigger storyline from this class was McGillney finally getting in. I was with you. It was like, is it ever going to happen? So, yeah, exciting news there. Well deserved for all involved, I think. That's going to do it for today's discussion, though, on the Metro Division and a little bit of Hall of Fame talk. Thank you, of course, to John Bailey and Kelsey Surmacz for joining me today on the Wraparound. We will be back tomorrow, or I will be back tomorrow, with a discussion of the Central Division. So you'll want to make sure that you tune in. For Kelsey Surmacz and John Bailey, I'm Emma Lingan. This is the Wraparound, and we will see you tomorrow.